Last week, the CIA's deputy director said that suspects in the foiled plot to attack Taylor Swift concerts in Vienna last month sought to kill tens of thousands of fans before the CIA discovered intelligence that disrupted the planning and led to arrests. The CIA notified Austrian authorities of the scheme, which allegedly included links to the Islamic State, also known as ISIS. The intelligence and subsequent arrests ultimately led to the cancellation of 3 sold-out Taylor Swift shows, devastating fans who had traveled across the globe to see her in concert. Meanwhile, Europe continues to take the jihadists' side in the Israel-Hamas-Hezbollah war, as if Israel is not the ultimate partner to curtail and deal with the Islamism that continues to sweep across the continent. This week, Britain said it would immediately suspend dozens of arms export licenses with Israel. Ireland's foreign minister recently said it was time for the bloc to re-examine its agreements with Israel, while European Union Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell has continuously taken anti-Israel positions throughout the nearly 11 months of the Israel-Hamas-Hezbollah war, such as spreading baseless blood libels that, quote, Israel is provoking famine, and, quote, starvation is used as a weapon of war. The combination of ultra-left-wing ideology and pro-Islamist policies has had a profound impact on European societies. Social cohesion has exponentially eroded as communities become more and more divided along ethnic and religious lines. The rise of populist and far-right movements is a direct response to this fragmentation, as disillusioned citizens justifiably seek to reclaim their national identity and protect their ways of life. While these far-right movements are often dismissed as reactionary or xenophobic, they reflect a deep-seated frustration with the direction in which Europe is heading. The failure of mainstream political parties to address the concerns of ordinary citizens has created a vacuum that populist leaders have been quick to fill. Moreover, the erosion of European values is not just a domestic issue. It has far-reaching implications for Europe's role on the global stage. Europe's moral authority, once a cornerstone of its soft power, has been undermined by its failure to uphold its own principles. The continent's inconsistent stance on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law has weakened its ability to influence global affairs and defend the liberal international order. This ideological shift is evident in the policies and rhetoric of many European governments and institutions. The focus on multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusion, while noble in intent, has oftentimes led to policies that prioritize the rights of minority groups over the broader interests of society. This has created a culture of appeasement, where legitimate concerns about immigration and asylum seekers, societal values, and security are dismissed as xenophobic or racist. Moreover, the rise of identity politics has further polarized European societies. The emphasis on group identities rather than shared values has fragmented communities and undermined social cohesion. This fragmentation is particularly evident in the debate over immigration and integration, where the focus on protecting minority rights has often come at the expense of addressing the challenges posed by large-scale migration. To add insult to injury, Europe's fractured societies have caused serious strains on the continent's relationship with Israel. As geopolitical dynamics shift and new challenges emerge, it is becoming increasingly clear that Europe cannot afford to lose Israel as an ally. The stability and security of the Middle East, the fight against Islamist terrorism, and the preservation of democratic values are just a few areas where Israel's partnership is indispensable to Europe. As Europe grapples with the threats posed by terrorism and radicalization, Israel's experience and expertise in security matters are invaluable. Losing Israel as an ally would mean losing a key partner in everything that once made Europe magnificent: democratic principles, rule of law, and human rights. Moreover, Israel is a leader in technological innovation, particularly in cybersecurity, agriculture, and medical research. European nations have benefited from Israeli advancements in these fields, which are critical to maintaining Europe's competitive edge in the global economy. As the world becomes increasingly interconnected, Partnerships in technology and innovation will define the future. By maintaining strong ties with Israel, Europe ensures access to cutting-edge developments that can drive economic growth and societal progress. There's also the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor. On September 9th, 2023, a memorandum of understanding was signed by India, the European Union, Germany, Italy, France, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates at the G20 summit. Under this memorandum, the countries committed to collaborate on establishing a dependable and reasonably priced cross-border rail network, consisting of two parts: the Eastern Corridor, which will connect India to the Arabian Gulf, and the Northern Corridor, which will connect the Arabian Gulf to Europe. But a key portion of the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor is its ability to inexpensively ship natural gas from India and Arabian Gulf states to Europe, which would break up Russia's natural gas monopoly on Europe and give the continent more leverage over Vladimir Putin. And Israel is the only stable Middle Eastern country on the Mediterranean that can be trusted to connect the region with Europe. Furthermore, the strategic location of Israel in the Middle East makes it a vital partner in managing regional security challenges. With ongoing conflicts and power struggles in the region, Israel's intelligence capabilities and military strength provide a critical buffer against the spread of instability to Europe's doorstep. And the Hamas-led attacks against Israel on October 7th laid bare an uncomfortable reality for the West. The threat from Islamic extremism is as real as ever. But as Henrik Rasmussen, the executive director of the Institute for Science and International Security put it, quote, "A long effort by the United States, Europe, and Israel to manage rather than solve security problems in the region has proven an utter failure, and Israel's approach of occasionally mowing the lawn with limited raids against terrorists in Gaza is the most immediate example of a policy that's no longer viable. Thus, to protect its citizens, Israel must now deal with Hamas once and for all. The US and Europe should give the country all the backing it needs to do so." End quote. Unfortunately, the exact opposite has happened during the last 11 months, with American and European governments effectively forcing the Israelis to fight Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other Iranian proxies, with two hands behind their backs. But the Americans and Europeans are not one and the same. The U.S. enjoys the benefits of geographic isolation and a relatively minor percentage of Arabs and Muslims, whereas some of Europe is a hop, skip, and jump away from the Middle East, and Arab and Muslim population growth is significant across the continent. Behind Hamas and these nefarious Arabs and Muslims are two terrible regimes, the Iranians and the Qataris, and the Europeans seem to be jumping into bed with them, oblivious about the Iranians and Qataris' deception to first enslave the West and then destroy it. Last year, for instance, French investigators scrutinized the activities and compensation of advertising executive François de Labrosse, who received payments from Qatar several years after his work for the former French president, Nicolas Sarkozy. Let's also recall the purchase of football club Paris Saint-Germain by the Qatar Sports Investments in 2011, when Sarkozy was president, and by the hypothesis of a corrupt deal sealed the previous year during a lunch organized at the Élysée Palace, attended by Sarkozy and the current Emir of Qatar, Tamim Al Thani. This past December, the European Union unveiled a proposal to curb political interference by foreign governments. The package needs approval from EU countries and the European Parliament, which is embroiled in a foreign influence scandal that has been dubbed Qatargate. Belgian authorities have been investigating alleged bribes, said to have been paid by Qatar and Morocco in an attempt to steer some of its deliberations. Meanwhile, the Iranian regime, which never misses an opportunity to call for death to Israel and death to America, continues on its path toward nuclear weapons. And while the foreboding chants in Tehran may be more focused on Jews and Americans, Europe is geographically much more exposed to Iran's missiles, drones, terror proxies, and threats to oil and gas supplies. In fact, Iran's hostile actions have already been impacting Europe directly. Russia has been deploying Iranian drones against Ukraine for over a year now, keeping Ukrainian air defenses and civilian infrastructure under stress. Tehran is also actively assisting Moscow in building up indigenous drone production capacity, potentially enabling Russia to build some 6,000 new attack drones by the summer of 2025. And these drones are not just a threat to Ukraine, they are a threat to every NATO country bordering Russia. As if that is not enough, there's the severe economic danger poses to Europe by Iran's threatening posture and support for terrorist proxies across the Middle East. For example, the October 7th massacres and kidnappings led Israel to shut down production at the Tamar gas field in the Mediterranean since it was located within range of rocket attacks from Gaza, resulting in an immediate price spike in Europe. This price spike pales in comparison to the likely economic effects of an escalation by other Iranian proxies, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen, let alone any attempt by Iran itself to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, where more than one-fifth of the world's oil supply passes on a daily basis. Some Europeans defiantly understand these threats. Last November, just 1 month after the October 7th massacres and kidnappings, British politician Suella Braverman wrote in The Times, quote, "It is the pro-Palestinian movement that has mobilized tens of thousands of angry demonstrators and marched them through London every weekend. I do not believe that these marches are merely a cry for help for Gaza. They are an assertion of primacy by certain groups, particularly Islamists, of the kind we are more used to seeing in Northern Ireland. This is not a time to be naive. We have seen with our own eyes that terrorists have been valorized, Israel has been demonized as Nazis, and Jews have been threatened with further massacres." End quote. Perhaps fearing that Britain's Arabs and Muslims would revolt against Braverman's uncomfortably true analysis. Then British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak promptly dismissed her from his cabinet. Whatever the official European line regarding the Islamic influence on Europe, the actions of its elected representatives, the police, the judiciary, and even faith leaders all suggest much the same thing. Islam is now on the ascendancy across Europe, and homage, if not downright appeasement, seems to be the only viable response. For instance, recently elected British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's Labour government is chomping at the bit to criminalize Islamophobia, the insane definition of which is, quote, "a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness." And at King's College in London, a counterterrorism course for UK civil servants teaches that, quote, "terrorism is not the problem. Rather, the systems they oppose are terrorist." And condemning terrorism is to endorse the power of the strong over the weak, as if the West is to blame for terrorism. The unifying thread here is the silencing of those noticing Islamic extremism on the streets of Europe rather than those committing it. Much of Europe's terror threat is at the highest level since 9/11, and governments have been warned that extremists are using the Israel-Hamas-Hezbollah war as a recruitment tool. In the UK, for instance, the government's robust response has included Foreign Office staff being trained not to refer to Hamas as terrorists, because the term is, quote, "unhelpful." At the same time, Europe's political and media establishments continue to look the other way, selling out women, Jews, gays, and democratic principles generally, even criminalizing free speech, in order to pacify radical Islamists and perpetuate the illusion of multicultural harmony. If you ask the eminent historian Bernard Lewis, migration and demography are working toward creating Eurabia. And those who dare to criticize Muslim extremists and speak up for true liberal values are systematically slandered as fascist bigots. According to author and political journalist Bruce Bauer, this struggle for Europe's soul is every bit as dire and consequential as it was in the 1930s. Then, in Weimar Germany, the center did not hold, and the light of civilization nearly went out. Now, the continent has entered yet another Weimar moment. Patience and tolerance towards a radical ideology, Islamism, that does not recognize the legitimacy of others' ways of life is the greatest enemy of peace and coexistence. If the Western ways of life are cherished, then there must be a willingness to stand up, fight against, and eventually defeat its enemies, even if these enemies are homegrown or otherwise located within one's country. The mere threat of massive retaliation, not backed by actual force, has not deterred Putin, Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Houthis, and it will not deter Iran and China. For autocrats and ideologues, mutually assured deterrence is not deterrence, but an incentive to keep upping the ante. This is why Israel is pounding the Gaza Strip, and it is why Israel's deterrence strategy has always relied on its enemies, knowing that the Jewish state will unapologetically inflict more damage than it takes, even if it means considerable destruction. Israelis understand that it is not their responsibility to look after the residents of another territory or country, especially at the expense of its own decent people and respectable values. Nor should it be. Make no mistake, Israel values human life as much as any society, but when your enemies try to manipulate this virtue against you, it is no longer an honorable virtue. Rather, and unfortunately, it is an acute weakness.